Jud, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, very much looking forward to continuing our conversation on neuroscience and everything that kind of underpins habits. This time, more of a focus on eating habits, which I know a number of our listeners will be very interested to hear from you on as a psychiatrist and neuroscientist. On the way here, I was kind of thinking, based on reading your new book and just being familiar with your work, thinking about what your mission is as a clinician and as an academic, would I be right, or would it be fair to say that it's sort of centered around giving people more agency, greater agency through teaching them about their brain? And then by understanding the way that their brain works, they can be more successful in breaking certain habits that are not serving them and forming healthier habits.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. If we don't know how our brain works, how are we possibly going to have any control? and we waste a lot of energy fighting with ourselves when it comes to bad habits, and that's wasted energy. So that's another piece that can free up energy that we can use productively.
And would it also be fair to say that you think a lot of the common strategies that people might be using to try and change habits, like willpower that you talk a lot about, are perhaps not appreciating how our brain works?
I think that's one way of putting it, not appreciating how our brain works. I would also more bluntly state it that, people that advocate willpower probably haven't looked at the neuroscience in depth, because there's really not a lot of overlap between neuroscience and willpower. Willpower is more of a story that we tell ourselves, both in terms of thinking, oh, here's a strategy that I can use, but also as a way to beat ourselves up when that strategy fails. Ironically, it's not a strategy that's not based on neuroscience is likely to fail most of the time.
I think in order for us to kind of step into eating habits, we need to kind of backtrack a little bit over some of the things that we spoke about in our previous conversation, get people sort of up to speed, and then we can dig into the tools and strategies that can help people specifically with regards to eating and changing eating behaviors. So to kind of define our terms and start right at the top here, what are habits?
Habits, simply put, are behaviors that we do automatically, and they get set up as a way for us to live an efficient life. Imagine waking up every morning and not knowing how to walk or put on your clothes or talk or make coffee. We'd be exhausted if we had to relearn each of those things every day. So the idea behind a habit, I think of it as set and forget. You set the habit and you forget about the details so that you can free that brain space up to learn new things. So 95, 98% of the behaviors we do every day are habitual and helpful.
And the decision to perform that behavior is unconscious?
Well, I would say it's set up based on how rewarding the behavior was in the past. And if a behavior is rewarding, we're going to lay it down as a habit and do it again. If it's not rewarding, we're also going to learn, hey, don't do that again.
And remind us what a habit loop is.
So a habit loop is how we learn a habit, and that gets set up through two processes that are related. One's called positive reinforcement. And this goes back to our ancient ancestors, related to food, actually, where we had to remember where food was. We had to learn where food was and then remember where it was. So we'd go out and forage in the savannah or the forest. And when we found food, that would be the first. So there are three elements of any habit loop: trigger, behavior, and a result. So the trigger is that we'd see some food. The behavior is that we eat the food. And if it's a source of calories, our stomach sends this dopamine signal to our brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it.
That's the reward.
That's the from a neuroscience standpoint, it's the reward. I think of pragmatically, it's the result, because often people think, oh, why am I doing this habit of procrastinating or worrying if it doesn't feel rewarding? So when something gets laid down as a habit, it had to be rewarding enough to get laid down as a habit through this, dopaminergic pathway. But then once it's a habit, we might continue doing it even if it's not helpful for us down the road.
Right. So it can be helpful or adaptive, beneficial in the short term, but maladaptive in the long term.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there can be competing forces that set up habits as well. So for example, nobody would argue that smoking's good for us, but teenagers, and most people learn to smoke when they're teenagers. There are these competing forces, whether it's rebelling or being cool at school or whatever, that's rewarding enough that it will overcome the initial literal nausea that comes from smoking a cigarette, because nicotine is a toxin. And our body, the first time we smoke a cigarette, our body's saying, hey, why are you putting toxin in me? I'm going to try to eject this. And so we feel nauseated, and we learn, our brain says, hey, why are you doing this? But we overcome it by saying, but I'm going to, force my way through this, because the reward of learning, smoking, for whatever the social reward is more rewarding.
So is this territory here different to instant gratification versus delayed gratification?
It's related. Absolutely. It's related. So delayed gratification is basically that, you're delaying the rewarding properties of something. So for example, a lot of studies have been done around delayed gratification with money. So it's like, oh, if I gave you $10 today versus $11 next week, what would you take? And most people would say, well, give me the $10 because I don't know if I'm going to see you next week. So the immediate reward, it supersedes the 10% or whatever the gain that they would get as the interest rate over 1 week.
And is that instinct? Is that because that favored survival, selecting for whatever was going to give you a short-term reward was more likely to result in survival?
Yeah, absolutely. It's that more likely that drives everything. It's that uncertainty. So the farther you look into the future, the more uncertain things are. The closer in temporally, time-wise, the more you can say, yeah, that's probably going to happen. And so that whole, it's called this delayed discounting curve, that the farther you go out into the future, the more you have to reward somebody for somebody to take that reward. And a lot of that has to do with uncertainty. We'd rather take the sure thing. It's all these sayings, a bird in hand is worth two in the bush, that type of thing. Those all come from uncertainty.
And if I'm remembering correctly from our last conversation, so you just kind of laid out that we form these habits through kind of 3 steps. Is that stimulus or trigger? Then presumably we have some type of desire or craving for something. We go and do a certain behavior. We get a reward. Yes. And then we establish an association between the behavior and the reward.
Yeah, absolutely. And the craving piece is sometimes there, but it's not always there. So with a habit, we might not notice any urge to do a behavior. We might just automatically do it. So it's not required, although it's often part of the equation.
Right. So you might not observe that. So I think you used an example last time. You walk into a room and the lights are off. Mm-hmm. And it might not register to you. I mean, you obviously know the lights are off, but do you have a desire or craving in that sense, in that context?
To turn on the lights?
Yeah.
Well, it depends. If it's nighttime and you're trying to crawl into bed without waking up your spouse, probably not such a good idea to turn on the lights.
Right, but it kind of just happens subconsciously when you walk into a room and you turn the light on.
Yeah. So that could happen if we walk, especially if it's a room and we don't know what's happening or we can't predict what might be going on in that room. That dark room signals unpredictability. Like we don't know what's happening. So we flip the light switch on, we can suddenly see what's going on in the room, and that reduces the uncertainty.
Is there any truth to this idea? And this could be completely wrong. I'm not a neuroscientist. That's why you're on the show today. So I want to throw something at you and you can tell me if it's stupid. But I have read and always thought that when it comes to things like delayed gratification, often the delayed gratification, that choice, that's the logical one. It's the rational one. Mm-hmm. And you often hear that when people are stressed or they're anxious, they, are more likely to make poorer decisions. Am I correct in that there is a certain part of the brain that's separate to these kind of default, older, sort of primitive part of the brain
Yes.
that controls logic and rationality. And when we are stressed or anxious, that part of the brain kind of shuts down a little bit.
Yeah, I'll just say, so anatomically, it's not really as pretty of a picture as the heuristics stories make it out to be. But the stories, and the heuristics are helpful. So, we often hear about the lizard brain or this older evolutionary part of the brain. The brain's pretty interconnected, and we can say, yeah, the neocortex is probably newer from an evolutionary perspective. And within the neocortex, the prefrontal cortex is the youngest part of the brain, and that's most associated with rational thinking and planning. So, and there's also a fair amount of good research that's been done. Amy Arnsten and others have shown that the prefrontal cortex goes offline when we get stressed or anxious. So if you put those pieces together, we've got this prefrontal cortex. It's the youngest, it's the weakest part of the brain. It's the first that goes offline when we get stressed. So we can't rely on that planning, that rationality when we're stressed, when we're anxious, when we're basically in danger. We go back to our old habit loops, and so we rely on that which helped us survive so far, as compared to saying, well, let me think through this for a little bit, because we don't have time to think through things when we're in danger.
And so if we're aware of a destructive habit, a behavior that we want to change, I've got a lot of questions that stem from this, but just while we're on this sort of prefrontal cortex topic, my understanding is that central to your thesis is bringing more awareness to our behaviors and being able to focus on the reward value, changing the reward value. And in doing that, you can break a habit loop and you can create a different habit loop that's serving you better.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's where the neuroscience, back in the 1970s, actually, there were two researchers named Rescorla and Wagner, and they developed this, what's now called the Rescorla-Wagner reinforcement learning equation, basically, that we still use. We just published a paper a couple of years ago using those same equations, because they largely have not changed over, 40 years, 50, however long it's been. And that shows that they really tapped into something really, really critical. And it has nothing to do with willpower. And it has everything to do with what's called this error term that's called positive or negative prediction error. And that basically says, once we set up a habit, it predicts that a behavior is going to go a certain way habitually. And if there's something that's different from the norm, we get an error term in our brain that says, hey, that didn't go as expected. Pay attention so you can learn something. To use a real world example, let's use one from eating. Let's say that a new bakery opens up in my neighborhood and I have a certain reward value for how good, let's say, mango habanero truffles are. Okay. And so they've got mango habanero truffles in their window. I'm like, oh, great. Let me go try those out. And if I eat one and my mind is blown, I'm like, wow, this is the best truffle I've ever had. I get what's called a positive prediction error, meaning my brain expected it to be this good, but it was better. And that error jacks dopamine in my brain that says, remember this. So I remember, hey, this bakery has good mango habanero truffles. On the other hand, if I eat it, I'm like, oh, this is kind of like cardboard. I get a negative prediction error. And my brain says, also gets a dopamine spritz, but I learn, hey, don't go back here in the future. So that's how we learn to change behavior. But notice how both of those require that we pay attention. So if I'm on my phone and I just scarf down the truffle and I go home and my wife's like, hey, how's that new bakery? I'm like, I don't know. It wasn't so good or so terrible that it forced me to pay attention. And I didn't pay attention, so I don't know. So I didn't actually learn anything. So awareness is that key ingredient for any type of habit change, whether it's fostering or forming a new habit like exercise or eating healthy food or whatever, or letting go of an unhealthy habit like, eating ultra processed food or eating chips or something like that.
And when we bring in this awareness piece, are we are we using awareness, mindfulness to keep the prefrontal cortex online so that we can be more rational? Or are we using it to kind of change those? Are the habit loops, are they situated in that neural circuitry of the older kind of primitive lizard brain?
Yeah, great question. So if it were as simple as, our rational brain being able to, think our way out of situations, we'd be in much better shape than we are as humans. The way I think of this is that our feeling body is much stronger and wiser than our thinking brain. And what I mean by that is the urges and the habits get formed based on feelings and sensations more so than thoughts. Because if we're like, oh, I shouldn't eat those chips, we've all told ourselves, oh, I should stop eating so many, or I shouldn't eat those chips that I just got served at the dinner table at the restaurant because I'm going to waste, ruin my appetite for dinner or whatever. We know these things, but knowing them isn't enough. So certainly it can help keep our thinking brain online because it helps us not get caught up in emotions. But more importantly than that, it helps us pay attention to the results of the behaviors. I'm thinking of a patient, a concrete example. So I had a patient who she came in, she would basically eat an entire large bag of potato chips every night as a way. She would bond with her daughter, her teenage daughters. And for anybody with teenagers, they do everything in their power to bond with their kids. So she would sit down and watch television with her daughter. And she had the habit of eating a bag of potato chips. And she's like, oh, this is terrible. She knew that eating those chips was not good for her. So I just sent her in with the instruction to pay attention as she ate the chips. Still, watch television, bond with your daughter, do all those things, but just pay attention and see how many chips is enough to satisfy that urge.
So she's paying attention to like satiety and hunger cue.
Yeah. And she would sit down after dinner so she could pay attention. She wasn't actually hungry. This was just a habit. What she noticed, well, first off, can you guess how many chips it took for her to, satisfy that urge?
10 to 15.
Yeah, it was 2.
2. Wow.
Well, 1, she wasn't hungry. So if she went in there hungry, I'm sure it would have been, a lot, many more chips. But she wasn't hungry, and she paid attention, and what she was highlighting and pointed out to me, she was like, wow, I didn't realize how salty these potato chips are. I don't know what type she had, but most potato chips are pretty salty. And so she'd be like, ugh. After 2 potato chips, she's like, okay, I'm done. And she could put the bag aside, still watch television, still bond with her daughter, but not have an urge to eat more, because she was noticing that she's like, oh, this doesn't feel so good.
So she had changed the reward value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, by paying attention. She had noticed what the actual reward value was. And so she changed the reward hierarchy in her brain around what it was like to eat a bag of potato chips. Right. So afterwards, after she ate the whole bag, she'd feel guilty and she'd feel bloated and crappy. But she's like, oh, how do I stop doing this? And then she'd go eat it the next night, do the same thing, because she didn't know how her brain worked. What she started to do was pay attention as she ate them. And she could see, oh, I can get my potato chip fix in 2 chips, stop eating without any force or willpower, because I just have to notice what that third one tastes like, and it's not rewarding. So that set value, I think of it this way, is she hit what I call the pleasure plateau. And so it's like we eat one and it's pleasurable. We eat another one, and eventually our body's going to say, hey, that's a bit much. And the way it's going to tell us that is they're not going to taste as good. We have that natural mechanism in there. It's not about thinking. It's about tasting and feeling. And so we hit that plateau, and often if we're not paying attention, we go over, I call this the cliff of overindulgence, right? We go off the cliff. So she used to go off the cliff with the chips. She noticed that 2 chips got her on the plateau, and she could coast to a stop without forcing herself or trying to force herself to stop.
So paying attention, being mindful allowed her to realize the true reward value.
Exactly.
And so before that, when you're eating mindlessly, you could be assigning greater reward value to a behavior.
Yeah. And assigning it at first, meaning that, for some reason and there's, we have this completion bias where we got to complete things. And that includes the there's just a couple of chips left, I might as well eat them. It's like the clean plate club. So there's some reward value to eating the whole bag. And then it becomes a habit and we don't pay attention to the reward value. And then when we start paying attention again, we notice as you put it, what the true reward is, and we can stop there.
So if we think about different addictions, smoking, or in this case, eating chips or any type of, quote unquote, kind of binge eating after dinner, which I think is pretty commonplace.
Yes.
A lot of people struggle with this.
Yeah. Nighttime snacking, binging. Yeah.
Has the more traditional in years gone by model to help people overcome these types of behaviors, addictions, if they are, has it been through abstinence, just going cold turkey? Is that the difference between the kind of paradigm or model that you're offering?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. So with substances, for example, and even behaviors, where people can abstain, that has been a very dominant model. Just say no, just stop it, don't do it. And so with cigarettes, with drugs, even with technology, people can do it. A phone fast where they're going to not check their social media for a month or something like that. With food, it's a little different. You can't exactly abstain from eating because it's critical for survival.
But in that example, your advice to her was to pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
It
As
wasn't
compared to just don't eat the chips.
Don't eat the chips after dinner.
Yeah. Lock your cabinet or whatever. Yeah, that doesn't really work.
That doesn't work.
No, I mean, you just look historically, look at all the studies. There are tons of studies showing that these restriction-based diets don't work. There's now a term called yo-yo dieting that's based on that. People lose weight and they regain it, and they lose it and they regain it.
Yeah, I have a quote here from Kevin Hall. More than half of the lost weight was regained within 2 years, and by 5 years, more than 80% of lost weight was regained.
Yeah. And the popular, what was it, The Biggest Loser, that television show from years ago? People did research on a lot of those participants, and I don't know what percentage of them regained all of their weight, but it was a large percentage.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but your kind of interest in eating, did that stem from your work with people who were trying to quit smoking?
Yes, it actually started with smoking. So we were working on helping people quit smoking. The traditional don't smoke cigarettes, it wasn't working so well in my clinic. So we did a randomized controlled trial where we had people pay attention as they smoked. And we also gave them tools to help them work with their cravings. And we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. And I was blown away by those results. And after that study, that was an in-person study that we did where, people were getting twice weekly groups, and we were trying to figure out how to scale that. So we started developing an app. And when we were pilot testing that, people in using that program were saying they were changing their eating habits. And I was thinking, okay, whatever. Most people will eat as a substitute strategy for smoking, and they'll gain on average about 15 pounds. And so I was thinking, oh, they're probably doing that. But they said, no, I'm actually cutting down on my snacking. And that, my eyes popped out of my head, and I listened to them and I said, what, tell me more. And they said, well, these techniques that you've taught me to help me with my cravings for cigarettes, I'm using those same things for my cravings for eating when I'm not hungry. And that's what got me interested in actually looking at the food pathways as well, and realized that this eating in the absence of hunger, this habitual eating is huge. It's prevalent. It's crazy. Like, so many people eat whether they're bored, whether they're, it's this food mood relationship, whether it's just overeating, and so that's an even larger problem than smoking cessation. So I started, looking into that and developing programs to help people with habitual eating.
Do you think that eating, despite not having a kind of physiological need for calories, would still be occurring in a different food environment if our food environment wasn't the way it is today?
I don't think it would be happening to the degree that it is. So we don't naturally overconsume natural foods. We stop when we're full. The fiber, the lack of like refined sugar doesn't drive us into a frenzy where we'll just, eat more. There's somebody on a podcast described this beautifully to me, when the interviewer was saying, yeah, it tastes like more. And that's what a lot of these food-like objects are designed to do, is not to taste necessarily good, but to taste like more, as in to get us to keep consuming. And that's exactly what the food industry's job is to get us to consume more. So if we didn't have engineered food, I don't think we'd have the obesity epidemic that we see today.
And you don't think we have the capability or the willpower to just flick a switch and say, I'm only going to eat whole or mostly whole foods? Because I think there's probably some people listening who maybe that was their experience, and they just think therefore everyone can do that.
Yeah. So all the Vulcans out in the audience that are listening, absolutely, they can nail it. Like Mr. Spock, who is the epitome of this hyper rational being. Where, what was his line? Highly illogical, Captain, when he talked to Captain Kirk. And it was beautiful. Those two came way before the Thinking Fast and Slow, the Kahneman book that, and Kahneman won the Nobel Prize, showing that, behavioral economics are actually, they're emotional economics. And so I don't know when Star Trek was first conceived, but Mr. Spock is that hyper-rational prefrontal cortical part of the brain, even before the term neuroscience was popular or commonplace. And Captain Kirk was this emotional, and he's seen as like that old reactive habitual part of the brain. So, that's one of the beauties of that old Star Trek show, was that they were highlighting these two, forces constantly at play in the mind. And those go back, even in ancient Greece, there's a relief on the Parthenon showing this chariot, or a horse and a rider, where the horse is the passions and the rider is reason. And we know which one's stronger. The horse is going to buck the rider off whenever it feels like it.
Right. So when we hear these stories of that person who says, I just went cold turkey and I quit smoking, or I read a book, I changed my diet overnight, I only ate whole foods, I lost 40 kilograms, it's easy, is part of the kind of illusion or trap there into thinking that applies to everyone and everyone could do that? Is that a survivorship bias? Are we only seeing like a piece of the data? Because that seems to be contrary to what we're seeing in these weight loss intervention studies.
Absolutely. So, the dropout, if you think of that as a naturalistic study, the dropout in that is huge. And when you go and interview the people for whom it worked, I'd want to know, what was it that drove them to quit smoking, for example? So one of the most common reasons that I see people in my clinical practice quit smoking is a family member. So whether it was a newborn child on the way, newborn child, or even I've heard plenty of stories of grandkids who say, grandma, grandpa, I don't, they come to them crying and they say, what's wrong? I don't want to see you die. What are you talking about? Well, you're smoking and I know it's bad for you. And then they're like, that's it. I quit. And they quit because the reward of that family member of helping out or pleasing or just connecting with that family member is much greater than the cigarette. So there's a lot, I just quit cold turkey. Well, how did you do it? A lot of it can be traced back to a greater reward value.
Would it be fair to describe the relationship that many people have with food, particularly what we might describe as low quality, ultra processed, kind of hyper palatable foods? Would it be fair to describe that as an addiction?
It's a great question. So, put briefly, I know you've talked about this with other guests on your podcast. The definition of addiction that I learned in residency, I like this because it it's pragmatic and it's somewhat universal, and it is continued use despite adverse consequences. And I like that for several reasons. One is I can remember it and my patients can understand it. But the other piece is it goes way beyond, the cocaine, the cigarettes, the heroin, the methamphetamine. It's a behavior, it could be social media, it could be whatever, texting while driving, and it could also be applied to food as well, right? So if somebody continues to eat despite adverse consequences, you could argue that that falls within that continuum of the definition of addiction, especially when they say they have no control. And you can look at all of the criteria that generally, are the checklist criteria in the DSM around addiction. A lot of it has to do with, obsession about, recovery from, and just general craving being a big part of it. That's in the newest definition, but also just feeling of loss of control. And if you talk to a lot of people who really struggle with uncontrolled eating, they're going to hit that checklist and they'll say, yep, that's me.
That kind of story you shared before of the woman eating the chips, and that was like an activity she was doing with her daughter, I think you said. Mm-hmm. Would that be described as emotional eating? It could be. I know a lot of people may have some underlying emotional experience or event or trauma that is kind of leading to a certain behavior, food choice. And I think I asked you this question in our last conversation, but I still am curious about this. Is it enough to just bring awareness to the behavior and try to kind of become clear, get a clear perspective on what the true reward value is? Or does the underlying kind of reason or emotional experience of that person need to be addressed as well?
I would say it depends. Okay. So, and let's use this example with this person. I would guess that she would describe her potato chip eating as a habit where she was not paying attention when she was eating. She might have set it up originally as emotional eating. We could think of all the scenarios where she's nervous, she wants to, I want to have a good time with my daughter. And then she eats potato chips to numb herself or to emotionally eat. And then that gets locked in as a habit. So you can see how that might originally get set up emotionally.
As a coping mechanism.
And then it just becomes a habit. By the time she came to see me, it was basically purely habitual. For a lot of people, this gets set up through an emotional coping mechanism. I can think of a million patients. I'm thinking of one in particular who had binge eating disorder, and she had learned to eat food as a way to numb herself. That's how she put it, to numb herself from negative emotions. And this started when she was like 8 or 10 years old. And she'd been doing this for about 20 years when she came to see me. And those were her words. I would eat to numb myself. So that was the coping mechanism for her for negative emotions.
So she didn't have to kind of quote unquote deal or experience those negative emotions.
Yeah. And she didn't know, and this is what the case is for a lot of people, is that she didn't know how to manage or work with or be able to hold those negative emotions. And so negative emotion comes up, it feels bad. There's the trigger, the behavior is to eat. And then the reward is that you numb yourself. It goes away temporarily. So we can see how that gets reinforced through negative reinforcement. If she had been given an alternative, and that's what I worked with her with, was to learn to bring in healthy coping mechanisms. And so she didn't necessarily, so this goes back to your other question, do you have to address the core issue of the trauma? If the trauma is ongoing, yes.
And because if you remove the coping mechanism, then those things that are kind of being suppressed could be brought to the surface again.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, especially if there's an ongoing trauma, then if the wound stays open, it's never going to heal. If it was a past trauma where somebody has PTSD or, post-traumatic stress disorder or something like that, they can learn these their brain tries to learn coping mechanisms that are often, unfortunately, ways of just perpetuating the memories, where it's like they have this flashback or a nightmare or something like that, and it feels unpleasant. So they somehow suppress it or numb it or avoid it or do something. And that just keeps that memory not only there, but reinforced. And it can actually get stronger. Or the emotional feel to it can get stronger, because the emotional feeling in the moment is added to the emotional feeling from the past. And so it's like, oh, yeah, it was bad. No, that was really bad. And so that can actually set this process going where it perpetuates things like PTSD until somebody learns healthy coping mechanisms to learn to work with the emotions in the present moment and be able to separate them from the memory of the past event. So knowing that something happened factually is very different than getting stuck in the story of that thing happening to me. And that story happens to us in the present moment.
So awareness being important to addressing both of those.
Yes.
Where does the feeling of shame or guilt enter this? Because I know behavior is providing some type of reward, but often comes with this aftermath of guilt and shame for that behavior.
Yeah.
And in your book, you wrote, "It's not your fault. You have not failed. You are not hopeless or weak or any of the other terrible things you might have told yourself as you ate yet another bite you knew you shouldn't. It's not you. There is nothing to feel guilty or ashamed about. It's the system we've built that has failed." Can you unpack that? The system we've built has failed.
Yeah. So thank you for highlighting that, because let's unpack these terms first, and then let's talk about the system that's failed us. The guilt, we feel guilty for things that we do. So guilt is based on a behavior. And then we feel ashamed of ourselves. So shame is about the self. And those two feed off of each other. So let's say that somebody binge eats. And so they have a binge eating episode, and then they feel guilty for doing that behavior. And that guilt triggers shame. And that shame, they feel ashamed for who they are, that they can't change their behavior, that they can't stop, that they can't be a better person. And that feeds back. And often, and I've even had patients that report this, triggers a second binging episode, because the only way they knew how to cope with their negative emotions before was to binge. And so now they've got this negative emotion of shame, so they binge again. So I think of this as like echo habit loops, where, that original binge triggers the guilt and the shame, and then that second echo habit loop of more binging. So the reason that I say that the system has failed us is that so often we are told, well, just use your willpower, gird your loins, do whatever, you just don't have enough willpower. And so then we feel ashamed for who we are based on the system that's telling us that we should do better, do better. You should just do better. The problem is that's not how our brains work. This was a brain that was set up to help us survive. It's gotten us this far. And now we're saying, oh, there's something wrong with us. Well, in fact, what's wrong with us is that we're not actually looking at the neuroscience that says, hey, this is not how you change the behavior. So the system is the one that relies, whether it's relying on shame or willpower or self-control or whatever term you use, that's the system that has failed us.
And the shame or the guilt that then causes the shame, I think all of us have experienced that, where you then beat yourself up.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And you spoke in the book about, and I thought this was really interesting, when you're beating yourself up, you're not kind to yourself.
Right.
What's the effect that has on your ability to kind of cultivate awareness?
Yeah. Well, so let's start with, why do we beat ourselves up in the first place? So when we've done something that we feel ashamed of, we feel like, oh, I got to do something. And beating ourselves up is doing something. It's literally, we're beating ourselves up. We're doing something. And we associate that with, if I beat myself up, I will do better next time. It's not been shown that beating ourselves up actually helps us do better. It might, in fact, do the opposite. And so where it gets in the way is that the beating ourselves up makes us, if somebody's attacking you, what are you going to do? You're going to close down to protect yourself, right? You're going to contract. Well, that is literally moving us into, if you think of Carol Dweck's terms of fixed and growth mindset, that's moving us into a fixed mindset. We're closing down. We're not open to learning. What we need to learn to be able to do is in moments where we've done something that was not according to plan, instead of beating ourselves up because we feel ashamed, that's that, oh no, I can't believe I did that. I'm a terrible person. And however we beat ourselves up. We can then flip that script to, oh, well, that didn't go so well. What can I learn from that? So if we inject some curiosity in that moment, we can actually open ourselves literally to learning, because that's what growth mindset's all about, is being open to seeing new possibilities, to seeing different ways of doing things. So we have to be open to the situation to be able to learn from it, and beating ourselves up does the opposite.
And I have to imagine that curiosity, being open to kind of feeling and present enough to pause and witness what we're experiencing, is made more difficult in an environment where there are a lot of things competing for your attention. Mm-hmm. So a question that I've got a lot from my community, usually related to nutrition, is, why do we have to give so much focus to food? Like, look at the centenarian populations. Mm-hmm. These people are healthy. They're living to 90 to 100. They're not buying all the books and listening to all the podcasts. They just go about their lives and they're healthy. And I tried to think of like an analogy to explain why I think you need more intentionality in Western environments. So I want to throw this to you and see what you think. But I liken the community or environment that we find ourselves in to like a maze. It's kind of designed to get you a bit lost. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of noise. It's hard to be present. It's hard to be mindful. There's a lot of seductive foods and other things, right? That can, I guess, kind of hijack or take advantage of the older primitive brain mm-hmm. that served us, right? And is responsible for why we're here today. Whereas in these centenarian populations, their environment is more like a labyrinth. It's set up to effortlessly find your way through. Is that a fair kind of place to land, that being mindful, being curious, what you're asking of people is much more difficult in the environment that we find ourselves in today?
Well, there are a bunch of questions that come from that, and I haven't done that research or interviewed those folks. So I'd have a ton of questions for them before I could feel like I could give a better, more accurate answer. But I'll give you some baseless speculation, some BS. And so my BS answer would be, if they are, so probably they're not surrounded by hyperpalatable food. And even if they are, they're not drawn to it because they're satisfied with the food that they have. And my guess is, I don't know, you tell me, do they generally eat, kind of whole food, based diets that are not, they're not eating takeout all the time and not eating a bunch of, chips for snacks and things like that?
Yeah, they do. And I think their diets are changing as some of those populations are becoming more westernized, sadly.
Yeah, I was going to say, their longevity is probably going to suffer because of that.
And it probably will. I guess something that I was interested in, and perhaps my point wasn't clear there, I haven't seen any research looking at, whether these people are more present. Are they more mindful? Are they more in touch with their body?
Yeah. Yeah, so that would be a great question to ask. And I would also, I think, getting at your question as well, I would look at, what's their day-to-day life like. And so often people are drawn to the social media or the snack or the whatever when there is something that is pointing out a lack in their life or doing something to try to throw them off balance. Whether it's, social comparison or the stress of yet another email or boss yelling at us or whatever, and looking for some quick fix that says, hey, I'll make you feel better quickly. And that, and it happens to be in a bag and it has a shelf life of 1,000 years, and then people get hooked that way. So, these folks that are they in those, high stress environments? Have they learned coping mechanisms through their lives? Have they got the wisdom that when there is a high stress environment, that they have the wisdom to know how to cope with those, negative emotions? One thing that I've seen in our modern day society is that, the Cornel West had a great term for our phones. He called them these weapons of mass distraction. And one way that I like to interpret that quote is that we have these ways of distracting ourselves quickly. So when we have a negative emotion, instead of learning to develop distress tolerance, being able to be with a negative emotion, we quickly turn to our phone and start scrolling on the news or social media or whatever, YouTube, TikTok, whatever it is, to distract ourselves. And so we learn, and anybody can learn
because we're
this.
trying to avoid the pain that comes with experiencing what we're feeling.
Exactly. As compared to leaning into the pain. I love this quote, the only way out is through.
Or the obstacle is the way.
Yes. Another great one. It was the original one from Marcus Aurelius. What stands in the way becomes the way, I think. And so what stands in the way becomes the way when we have no quick fix next to us. And when given a choice, that goes back to the delay discounting. If somebody's like, oh, here's my phone, I can distract myself quickly, and they don't see the negative consequences of that, which is that they're losing their distress tolerance, they're going to pick that phone up every time.
So what is it that separates someone who has really good stress tolerance and coping mechanisms and someone who doesn't? And is that something that is learned, is something that we can change later in life, or is it something that's kind of concrete in our formative years?
I would say yes. Yes and yes to the first two and no to the third. So I would say it's something we can learn, and it's something we can learn anytime in life. And I would call that the development of wisdom. And wisdom comes from experience. So if we're willing to learn from our experience, we develop wisdom, because that's going to help us down the road. And if we are willing to look at and feel and be with our negative emotions, it doesn't take a lot to learn that we can actually be with things that are unpleasant, especially if we don't spin these stories of fear and dread around them. That story of me, like, oh, I'm scared or whatever. Oh, there's fear. What does fear feel like? Oh, it feels like this and this and this. Oh, okay. Here's worry. Oh, okay. What does anxiety feel like as compared to I'm going to distract myself because this is too unpleasant? The unpleasantness doesn't make our heads explode. And I say that with a smiling face because I had a patient who literally came in to my office and said, hey, doc, I feel like my head's going to explode if I don't smoke, right? So it can feel like head exploding in the moment. And within a few more moments, that head exploding feeling can have already passed.
It's liberating.
Mm-hmm. Extremely. And that's wisdom.
Allow me to introduce you to Momentous, my go-to supplement brand for all things protein and creatine. It's pretty easy, especially if you're not tracking everything that you eat, to fall short of the optimal daily protein intake. To help reach my daily protein target, I complement my diet with 1.5 scoops of Momentous's chocolate or vanilla chai plant-based protein for 30 grams of protein and all essential amino acids, which supports muscle growth, hormone and collagen production, skin health, and recovery. I also consume 10 grams of Momentous's creatine daily to enhance energy production, muscle strength, bone health, and cognition, with studies now showing the benefit of creatine on short-term memory and intelligence. I'll do anything for a little extra brain power. And what's really cool is that both products are NSF certified. This certification is the only third-party certification program trusted by the likes of the NBA, the MLB, Ironman, etc. With this, you can be confident that Momentus's protein and creatine are free from unsafe levels of contaminants, prohibited substances, or masking agents, and that what is on the label actually matches what is in the product. For discounts on these supplements, visit livemomentus.com and use code LIVINGPROOF for up to 36% off on subscriptions or 20% off one-time purchases. That's livemomentus.com with code LIVINGPROOF at checkout.
Okay, I'm keen to kind of bring all of this together for the listener in this specific context of changing eating habits. So I have an avatar that I want to kind of workshop with you.
Okay.
So let's pretend that you have a gentleman that comes in to see you. His name is Chris, and his goal is to lose 15 kilograms. He's been to see his physician. Maybe he has pre-diabetes. They've told him, you need to lose some weight. He tends to eat what he would describe as a fairly healthy diet. Most nights he'll have a couple of glasses of wine with dinner, and often after dinner he finds himself kind of binge eating on sweet foods while he's watching TV before bed. And these are two habits in particular: the drinking a couple of glasses of wine each night and then having some sweet food before dinner that he would like to let go of. Mm-hmm. He's tried before, and his approach before has been abstinence, just not buying these foods, or saying, as of tomorrow, I'm no longer going to drink wine, I'm no longer going to have dessert, and also calorie tracking. Mm-hmm. And these have kind of served him or helped him in the short term, but ultimately have failed, and he's gone back to his old habits.
Okay.
So my first question here is, why doesn't something like calorie tracking work, at least in the long term?
Yeah.
Because if from a mathematical sense, from a control sense, on paper, it seems like something that should result in weight loss and then weight maintenance.
Yeah. So starting with that, I would say for the Vulcans in the audience, calorie tracking would work extremely well. For the people that can be hyperlogical and just need to know how many calories they've taken in and how many they need to put out. Actually, I have a friend who did it just by the book job of losing post-pregnancy weight by calculating how many calories she needed to eat or not eat, and she lost the weight in 6 weeks or whatever she had planned, and it all went perfectly because she can just be like, yep, I'm not doing that. And so the tracking can be really helpful for people that are those hyperlogical, and I would say the reward value there is in following the logical plan. Like it's not just that you're just going to stop doing things. There's something very rewarding about being able to follow a plan.
Is that a genetic difference?
I'm sure there are genetics involved. I mean, genetics are involved in everything. So it doesn't really mean much, but for some people, they've kind of hit that genetic lottery, and they're really good. It just seems to come as a natural thing to them. So I'm not, and some people just need to become aware of how many calories they eat. I've had a number of folks who are shocked when they just add up all the calories that they've eaten in a day. They're like, what? They had no idea.
And that awareness can help them assign a new reward value.
Yeah. Yeah. So that in itself, kind of leans into the awareness category where they've been unaware in the past. So this isn't to say that calorie counting doesn't work for anyone. It's to say, in the rarefied cases for the Vulcans out there, that would be what I would give them, and they wouldn't need anything else. For the rest of us, it can help develop awareness. For example, if we're just not aware of how many calories we're putting away, But beyond that, using that as the stick, it doesn't work so well.
So where would someone like Chris begin, who has tried calorie tracking? He tried complete elimination. Both of these things worked in the short term, but ultimately failed.
Yeah, I would split the alcohol and the snacking into separate categories. And I'd start with the alcohol because the alcohol can often, make it harder to rely on that prefrontal cortex or just to remember things. And so it can also be associated with other, kind of that enabler of other cravings. So we might crave sweet things after we've had a couple of glasses of wine or a couple of drinks.
So alcohol contributes to the prefrontal cortex going offline.
Yeah. So I would start asking questions like, what's the difference between when you have a couple of glasses of wine or a couple of drinks at night versus when you don't? And often people don't notice, for example, that it affects their sleep, or that it just makes it harder for them. They feel a little not quite awake in the morning. It takes them a little longer to kind of become ungroggy. So there are a lot of negative consequences that even come from 1 or 2 glasses of wine that people don't even notice until they start to pay attention and then notice them. And then they're like, how did I not see that before? So that's an example of where, I just like to go in and objectively take an inventory of what all the results of the behavior are. So for example, what's the reward that somebody gets from having a couple of drinks with dinner? For a lot of people, alcohol, when they really pay attention, they're like, I could take it or leave it. It's not like the best tasting thing in the world, and for somebody that's really struggling, like hard alcohol, you have to mask the taste of that thing because it's burn. It tastes like burning because it's our body saying, hey, this is not really good to consume, So we can really pay attention and see what the process that we've learned to associate with the relaxation or the whatever that is there, that is kind of triggered and induced by the alcohol. How much of the process can we keep and let go of the alcohol? Just using a parallel example, my patients who want to quit smoking, I ask them, so what do you get from smoking? And they're like, well, I relax. I'm like, well, cigarette, nicotine's a stimulant. So where's the relaxation in the smoking? It's like, well, I get to go out on a smoke break. Oh, well, what if you went out on a non-smoke break? And they go out on that non-smoke break and they start to realize, okay, they like the socialization with the, other people, or just to get up and walk around, for 15 minutes as compared to sitting at their desk all day. And so they can learn to actually get that break without the smoking. And they can learn to capitalize on the rewards that they're getting from that behavior and let go of the unhelpful behaviors. We can do the same thing with alcohol. So for example, if it's getting to relax before dinner, or, having something tasty with dinner, there are lots of drinks that are non-alcoholic that taste good. Whether it's, flavored seltzer water, or some people like kombucha, or, there are lots of things that can provide that, that palate pleasing taste, whether it's before dinner, with dinner, after dinner, whatever, that aren't alcoholic. And they don't have the negative consequences that come with the actual 2 carbon fragments that come with that. So, that's one thing that I would split out start with.
Do people have more success with breaking a destructive habit if they're replacing it with another habit? So like the example there that you used with, so let's say someone's drinking to feel relaxed. Mm-hmm. So step 1, they cultivate awareness, they're mindful, and they realize, oh, hang on, I don't actually enjoy the taste of alcohol, but it's making me feel relaxed. Mm-hmm. Are they going to have more success in breaking that habit by replacing it with another habit that helps them achieve relaxation?
So that can often be an intermediate step. And I say that because the ultimate solution is learning how to relax without needing anything external, because that is something that we can always rely on. if we have some type of substitution, then we just learn to rely on that. And if we're not targeting the underlying mechanisms, the substitutions are always going to fail at some point, whether we don't have them or they're not providing the relaxation that we wanted. And then we get freaked out like, oh no, I'm not as relaxed. I need to do something else. This isn't working. I need more, or whatever. As compared to learning, oh, here are emotions. These are unpleasant. I can learn to be with them, right? That's always available. And that's something that the more we lean into it, the stronger it gets.
So does that also apply to something like breath work, for example? Mm-hmm. You said we need to learn how to relax. Mm-hmm. Is adopting something like breath work, is that just another replacement?
It depends on what you mean by breath work.
Well, let's just say someone learns a type of breathing that helps them feel relaxed.
Yeah, it could be seen as another type of replacement as compared to learning to be with their emotions. That's the ultimate, I don't want to say cure, but the ultimate way of working with our emotions is really learning to see them for what they are and feel them and be with them and not resist them. So breath work could be a way of distracting ourselves from those negative emotions.
Yeah, that's the distinction I was trying to get to. So ultimately, you need to experience those emotions. Mm-hmm. And it almost seemed like earlier you were labeling them. Oh, that's fear. That's anxiety.
Yes. So this is actually popularized by a well-known Burmese meditation teacher named Mahasi Sayadaw back sometime in the 1900s. And it's a practice that's commonly taught in certain Western, Vipassana or insight meditation circles, where they literally talk about noting your experience. So if there's thinking, you just note thinking. If there's seeing, you might note seeing, or you might note green, white, wood, color type of thing. If I'm just looking around, you'd note what you're hearing, if there's sounds and body sensations, tightness, tingling, burning, heat, expanding, contracting, those types of things. So the noting is really helpful for inducing what's described both in physics and psychology as the observer effect. And I think I read a little bit about this in the hunger habit as well, where by observing, we can't be simultaneously as identified with an emotion or a thought or a feel or a body sensation. So if we note them or label them, oh, that's thinking, that's different than I'm thinking this. And we're so identified that we're caught up in that story. Yeah, exactly. It gives us the distance, the perspective. Distance isn't the perfect word because we're not distancing ourselves from them, but at the same time, we're getting perspective and we're getting some distance from being identified with.
This is a huge sidebar, but do you have any views on psychedelics, psychedelic therapy? I know I've done quite a bit of reading and I've spoken to a couple of professors about some psychedelic compounds giving people more perspective.
I think so. In fact, when we published our first big paper on what expert meditators' brains look like, 2 months later in the same journal, this Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the first paper by Robin Carhart Harris came out in the same journal when they had done their first IV neuroimaging studies of psilocybin, and they found the exact same neural networks were affected, were deactivated. So this default mode network, this self-referential network. So scientifically, there seems to be some pretty good evidence that both meditation and psychedelics are affecting the same systems. And I would say pragmatically, for people for whom they don't, it's the concept of selflessness or the concept of not being identified with the story is very foreign. Psychedelics can be like throwing that hand grenade in your brain and like blowing it wide open and getting it. I mean, this is why these are called mind expanding drugs, right? Getting a sense of not self, of more pure awareness, let's say. And so I would say there are parallels there, and there might be even ways that these two could facilitate each other. So for example, if somebody were to take a psychedelic trip, especially one that's, with a good trip sitter monitored and with all the right conditions, they could get that sense of selflessness and then train in mindfulness, for example, as a way to help train themselves that they can tap into this space, right, without needing the drugs, right? Because ultimately, the psychedelics are pretty non-addictive, but relying on something to do it for you isn't going to be an ultimate path. And in fact, that's what, there's this great documentary on Ram Dass called Fierce Grace. And part of that movie was about, he and his friends were, when he got kicked out of Harvard for doing his psychedelic research, they all were like just dropping LSD all the time. And they went to India and met this guy, I think it was named Curly Baba, if I remember the guru's name. And they gave him like a crap ton of psychedelics. And he just like swallows them and nothing happens. And they're like, oh, you don't need drugs for this. And then he comes back and writes Be Here Now and, and starts teaching people to meditate because he realizes, LSD isn't going to be the ultimate fix. It might be a window into selflessness, but ultimately we need to learn to tap into it ourselves.
So it seems like the awareness piece, there's focusing on your emotions, what you're experiencing, what you're feeling, and then there's focusing on the behavior that you're adopting. What happens to the brain when we do this? Is there any research looking at, the brain is plastic. Are we literally changing the neural circuitry and neurotransmitters as we're doing this?
It's a good question. It's really hard to measure changes in neurotransmitter level. The level of, being able to get at that level of resolution isn't quite there yet, and it's pretty expensive and challenging to do. What I would say is that when people get caught up in craving, for example, there are a lot of studies that all consistently point to a network of brain regions. This is actually the same network that's affected by psychedelics and meditation, this default mode network that gets activated, in particular a brain region called the posterior cingulate cortex that gets activated when we get caught up in craving. And my lab a couple of years ago did studies, these neurophenomenologic studies, where we could give people feedback from their own brains in real time, where we could line up their subjective experience with their brain activity. And we found that it was that getting caught up in experience is what correlates with activation in the posterior cingulate cortex. And that same brain region gets activated when somebody's caught up in a craving. And these can range from gambling to cocaine to chocolate to cigarettes.
It's the same part of the brain.
Yeah. And we even found, we did a study, this is a collaboration with Amy Janes, who's now at the National Institute of Mental Health, but she was at Harvard at the time. She had the smoking cue reactivity paradigm where people that wanted to quit smoking, we could bring them in, show them pictures of people smoking to activate this brain region at baseline, and then we could randomize them to get mindfulness training, or we used the National Cancer Institute's app, it's called Quit Guide at the time, to see if we could help people quit smoking and scan them a month later to see if there are differences in brain activity. And we found that there's a direct correlation between reductions in this, it's called the posterior cingulate cortex, this hub of the default mode network, and reductions in cigarette smoking, but that is specific to the mindfulness training. It wasn't found with the other app, this active control app that was not based on mindfulness. It was based more on cognitive therapy. So
the reward centers are in the default mode network?
Technically speaking, if you look at these reward pathways that are, dopaminergic, these tend to involve brain regions like the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens in rodent models. These are called the ventral and dorsal striatum. So those are communicating in some ways with the default mode network, but they're different. They're different networks.
Yeah, it's curious to me that, your on-ramp to eating habits came from working with people that were trying to quit smoking, right?
Yep.
And I think it was a couple of months ago, I was reading an article on GLP-1 agonists, so Ozempic, and there was these are anecdotes at this stage, but there was this article that was describing a number of people that had been prescribed GLP-1 agonists to help curb hunger, had also noted that they had less desire to have cocaine or gamble or smoke cigarettes, any other kind of vice they had. And I think at least the hypothesis that I read was that it might be because this compound is acting on this, this part of the brain that's responsible for reward or desire generally.
Yeah. Anecdotally, I can think of one patient who was put on, whatever GLP-1 drug, she was put on for weight loss, and she also had severe, addiction with alcohol, and was finding that it was much easier. She had just lost her cravings for drinking. That lasted for about 4 months for her, and then it kind of stopped working for her. So I could certainly see for certain periods of time, and it may last longer for other people, it does hint at, and the studies need to be definitive here, but it does hint at those having shared pathways.
Yeah, I guess the cynic in me thinks about how many distractions we have around us. And, I think of like the obesity epidemic, the food environment that we have, the effect that that's having on cardiometabolic disease. And so intellectually, I understand what you're saying about cultivating mindfulness. The cynic in me is like, do we have it in us to do that at scale?
Yeah.
Or is it pharmacology that's going to get us there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I wouldn't hold my breath for pharmacology. I think the GLP-1 drugs have gotten the closest, but they're still, the long-term effects are unknown. There are a lot of questions that, these are pretty new, and we're basically in an ongoing naturalistic experiment now with all the people taking these drugs. And, there's data coming out showing that if you go off the drug, you tend to regain the weight.
What's the rebound effect?
Yeah. So certainly, it's a good business model for the pharmaceutical companies that you have to be on this the rest of your life. That's tough, for whether it's healthcare costs or just individuals who want to not be on medication their whole life or whatever. So here, I think a lot of people would love to have a magic pill, and not have to do the quote unquote do the work. I would also say there are a huge amount of benefits to learning how our brains work that go way beyond food, because we can't just medicate away our emotions. We can't just medicate away unpleasant thoughts. We can't just medicate away, if somebody has a different political view than we have. We can see how isolation does not help us as individuals or as society. So ultimately, the sooner we can see that it's actually not a huge amount of work to foster curiosity, and that there are huge rewards that come from that, ranging from learning how to not binge eat to not, night snack, to actually listen to our neighbor who might have a different political opinion and realize they're still human. We're both humans. And if we're going to actually get along in this society, we can't just other everybody else. Right. I think there are huge benefits that come with learning curiosity, and it's not as heavy a lift as it might sound.
Yeah. And one of the, potential downsides of approaching desire or trying to reduce desire for certain behaviors through pharmacology, and I'm speculating here, but not all desire is bad. We need desire to have joy.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with desire. Yeah, especially if we can learn how to not feel like we're out of control every time we have a desire.
I know you've done research with people who are trying to quit smoking. Have you ever thought about doing a clinical study. Obviously, they're very expensive, but a randomized controlled trial that looks at kind of employing some of these tools and strategies built around awareness and seeing how effective they are in the long term. I had Christopher Gardner on from Stanford, and he was the main researcher involved in diet fits, which was, you may be familiar with it, but long kind of term, I guess, for a nutrition intervention anyway, sort of 12-month low carb versus high carb weight loss study.
Mm-hmm.
And his thing is, let's not have a one diet that's kind of set up to fail. Let's do 2 high quality diets.
Yeah.
So people eating whole foods, working with dietitians, but one's doing the low carb approach and one's doing high carb. And at 12 months, no difference in weight loss. There was a bit of weight loss in both groups, but no difference in terms of the mean. But what he did observe was in both groups, some people lost weight and some didn't.
Yeah.
And they went back and looked at, is it genetics or is it things like insulin resistance that maybe predict this? And no. And I asked him, I said, what do you think predicts why some people are successful? And he said it's probably behavioral. And so I'm curious to hear from you if you think there's a place for some type of long-term clinical study where you have a control group and then you have a group who is paying attention, is kind of employing some of these mindfulness practices along the way.
Yeah, I think so. Typically, gold standard is 1 to 2 years of follow-up, because that's when you know whether you're going to have a real effect. And like you're saying, it's also pretty expensive to do. I think the closest studies we've seen related to mindfulness, there's some acceptance and commitments therapy studies, I think, that had those 2-year follow-ups, and they were encouraging, promising. I don't remember the specific details, but like you're pointing out with the previous study, it's hard to find any effect of anything that's purely based on the rational thing. And so acceptance and commitment therapy is more along the lines of the behavioral, and I would say, I don't know if it's what they did specifically, but I would say the more we can focus on the reward value, the more, that's what I would want to study. That's the study I would want to do and do a 2-year follow-up. So for example, we've actually done mechanistic studies to see how quickly that reward value changes in somebody's experience, where we have people pay attention as they overeat, for example. And it only takes 10 to 15 times of somebody overeating for that reward value to drop below 0 and for them to start shifting that behavior. So it doesn't take long for that to take effect. What I would want to see, and we haven't done the research on, is how often does somebody need to revisit that memory? I think of it as developing this disenchantment database. So somebody can become disenchanted pretty quickly. How often do you need to refresh that memory? Whether it's like eating that bag of chips and remembering, oh crap, yeah, that's why I stopped doing this, or just recalling the last time they did that. And I'm thinking of my patients who have gained sobriety from alcohol, and one of my patients every morning she'd wake up in the morning and notice what it feels like not to have a hangover and recall what it was like when she was drinking. And that contrast helped really show the big difference. It's a relative shift that we're looking at, so you can become disenchanted with a behavior and you can become enchanted with the new behavior. And the bigger the differential, the more likely that differential is to help, keep this one high up. And so that's a study I would want to do, is to see 2 years out, what that looks like. I've had a number of people in our Eat Right Now program who are, now 7, 8 years out, and, who've lost, somebody just wrote me an email not too long ago saying that they had, lost over 100 pounds. This is 8 years ago. Everest Base Camp, stuff like this, that they were on their bucket list and now able to do these things. But that's anecdote, where people lose a ton of weight. and they can't imagine going back. They've kind of locked in that reward value of the
So
new way of being.
that's when it's locked in. Because I imagine
Yeah.
as more and more time goes on, it's harder to remember what it felt like.
Yes, it is. And I'm thinking back to, so for example, and I write about this in the Hunger Habit, I used to be addicted to eating gummy worms. I can't remember the last time I've had a gummy worm, but my wife gets, like, somebody in her family gives them to her at Christmas every year. And I look at them and I still have this feeling. So it's there. I don't go deep into what it was like to eat, a whole bag of gummy worms, but I don't need to. It's like that yuck factor is still there enough for me. And I don't know what it's like if that's the same for everyone, but we need just enough that says, ooh, this isn't worth it.
So let's come back to Chris.
Oh yeah.
Chris was not only having difficulty giving up the wine every evening, but he was also finding himself binge eating after dinner. So just to get really practical here, what would that look like for him on a nightly basis at the beginning in terms of cultivating awareness? What is he kind of trying to pay attention to? Yeah,
I would start by having Chris pay attention to the results of the night snacking. So how do you feel afterwards? How was his sleep? All the results. And then, so he could really carefully catalog those. Then I would have him pay attention as he was night snacking to play with that pleasure plateau. What's the first bite like? What's the second bite like? Because for a lot of people, they just need a couple of bites of something sweet and then they're good. And that generally is not a problem, right? So I would have him pay attention to those, find that pleasure plateau, start playing with that. And then I would have him just explore what's it like not to eat after dinner. And I do this myself. A couple of years ago, I just started eating, it's like not eating anything. Like, I used to have snacks at night, no big deal. But I just stopped eating after dinner. And I realized that I slept much better, especially if I ate an early dinner, so like eat at like 4 or 5 and then, not eat until, breakfast the next morning. And I would just get to sleep more easily, and sleep was, more continuous and better sleep metrics. And so I would have him pay attention to the benefits that come with, not night snacking. Especially, and on top of that, so what I still notice after years of doing this is occasionally I'll have a craving to eat some food at night, and especially if I'm in bed and my brain's like, oh no, if you don't have a snack, you're not going to get to sleep. And I've learned to just like notice those sensations, and they go away pretty quickly. It's that thought, that fear thought, there's a craving, and then within a minute or two, it's gone, and then I'm all good. And so I would have Chris and anybody else that wanted to play with this just notice, like, it's not that hard, especially if we don't resist our cravings. So that saying, what we resist persists, it's true.
Break that down.
Yeah.
Because that almost seems contrary to the idea of just saying I'm going to have dinner and not eat anymore after that. Like, so if someone is experiencing cravings after dinner, is the best line of action to resist that and not eat something, or is it to eat a little bit of something?
I would start with like not putting any rails on it and just do what they normally do, so they could catalog what that baseline is. Then I would have them pay attention as they ate a little bit of something, explore that pleasure plateau, see how much they need to satisfy that urge, that itch. And then if they wanted to, I would have them explore using curiosity as a way to ride out a craving. And just, if they're not hungry, just not eat.
Is that what urge surfing is?
Yeah, it basically.
Right. Ride out that craving.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have the formal protocol that we've used in our studies, whether smoking or eating, is that we have people, it's called RAIN, the acronym. So R stands for recognize. So recognize that you have a craving coming on. A stands for allow or accept that it is there. So if we resist the craving, it's going to get stronger. The I stands for investigate. And that's where we get really curious. Instead of going, oh no, here's this craving, and fighting it or resisting it, we go, oh, what does this craving feel like? And the N stands for note. So we note the sensations as they come and go. It's like tightness, tension, burning. Here's a thought. Here's this. Here's this. And so we can, as that wave of a craving comes up, we can get on that wave. We can ride it until it goes away.
Okay, that makes sense to me. So we're not resisting the craving in that we are seeing it for what it is.
Yes. Yes.
That craving is there.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that we have to reach into the freezer and grab the container of ice cream. That's, if we're quote unquote kind of depriving ourselves of ice cream, that's what I was thinking when you were saying resistance.
Yeah. Well, deprivation, it's funny that you say that, depriving ourselves of ice cream. What are we really depriving ourselves of? If we're having a craving for ice cream and we're not hungry, we're not actually depriving ourselves of anything calorically because our body's got its needs met. So we can say we're depriving ourselves of indulging a craving. And this is where we can actually get into this territory of meeting our needs instead of feeding our wants. So we can say, oh, and I get this a lot where people say, well, isn't that, aren't you not taking care of yourself if you're not, feeding those wants? And it's really about, that's not the right question. The question is asking ourselves, what do I need? So if we're lonely, if we've got some strong emotion, if we have something happening, food is not going to fix an emotion. It's just going to distract us momentarily and feed the habit of eating when we have a strong emotion. The true way of taking care of ourselves. So I think of this as the self-care as compared to self-indulgence. When we are truly asking the question of what do I need, we are caring for ourselves when we meet that need, as compared to scratching that itch of an urge when we want something.
Yeah, we really have to work with our psychology
yes.
to get out of this.
Yeah. And it's not some crazy sit on the couch 4 days a week for 40 years type of work with our psychology. It starts with just learning, oh, this is how our brains work. Oh, I can be with emotions and thoughts instead of having to do something about them, where that being becomes the new doing. It's not, I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's not that complicated.
Right. It sounds very intuitive to be in touch with your feelings, your emotions. What's happened?
Well, I think there's this attention economy that learned that it can get us to buy stuff to distract ourselves by scratching those itches of an urge that says, ooh, that's unpleasant, make it go away. I'll make it go away for $19.95 a month, And so the more that attention economy revs up and gets us to buy things, the more it is incentivized to keep us distracted. And the farther away we distance ourselves from ourselves.
Let's come back to Chris. Let's say that he comes back in to see you as a patient and he says, Doc, I've been employing some of these tools and it's been helping. But here and there I'll have a slip up.
Mm-hmm.
And once I have a slip up, I just go for it.
Mm-hmm.
I end up eating the entire tub of ice cream.
Yeah.
Is this something that you come across a bit?
It's so common that there's a scientific term for it. It's called the abstinence violation effect.
Okay.
My patients call it the F-its.
Yeah, F-it. I've had 3 or 4 scoops. I may as well go the whole tub.
Yep. So whether you use the scientific or the common term, it doesn't matter. It's the same phenomenon, and it is very, very common. So here, what I say is, great. you slipped up. If someone is open to learning from that situation, they're actually better off than if they're not open to it. So, often people think, oh, I took 2 steps backwards. And what I ask people is, do you learn more when you struggle than when you don't struggle? And typically the answer is yes, because that's, in that struggle is the growth and the learning. So if somebody can be open to learning in that slip up, they can actually learn more about themselves and more about their brains and more about how to work with future slip ups than if they sit there and berate themselves and beat themselves up and say they've failed.
In your book, you spoke about measurement. Earlier we were talking about the ways in which the, current system is kind of set up for us to fail, or perhaps isn't serving us as best as it could in terms of helping us build better habits. And we spoke about willpower, but another aspect of that system was measurement.
Yeah.
So how are we going wrong when it comes to measurement with regards to changing eating habits? And what would you be recommending to someone like Chris if he's interested in knowing, is this actually working? How am I measuring success?
Yeah. So this isn't to say that measurement is off the table or not helpful, right? So we talked about how some people just need to see how many calories they're consuming, and they haven't noticed that before. One thing that is right now problematic with calorie measuring, for example, is that it's notoriously not accurate. So, these apps, there are not one size fits all, because we are all individual beings and have different metabolisms and different genes and this and that. So at best, they're approximations, right? So that just needs to be kept in mind. There are 2 other pieces that need to be kept in mind as well. One is that there's this saying that's called Goodhart's Law. It was somebody, Goodhart, back in the 1970s, I think, said this. And he basically said, when the measurement becomes the goal, it stops being a good measurement. And so in the book, I talk about 10,000 steps being a good example of that. When people, they're like, I have to do 10,000 steps, I have to do 10,000, and they're focusing on like doing. My wife has actually done this at times where she's like, I'm at 9,900 steps. And so before bed, she's brushing her teeth, walking around the room.
You wrote about that. I remember reading that. Yeah.
So that's the goal, is to be active, and activity has been shown to be healthy. It's not some magic 10,000 steps. So here's a great example of when the measurement becomes a goal, it ceases to be good measurement. So it's not about getting that 10,000 steps. It's about getting a relative measure of whether we're being active or not. The third thing I'll mention is that measurement distances us from ourselves. When we focus on the metrics, we're not listening to our bodies. Our bodies are the wisest feedback mechanisms that we have, full stop. And no metric is going to beat this intricate, highly evolved body that we have. And so, again, measurement can be an adjunct, but it's not the only way, unless you're a Vulcan. So here we have to notice, are we focusing on the metric as compared to listening to our body? And if we're doing that, that's going to be problematic as well.
So if the measurement is not the goal, what is the goal for someone like Chris?
If he's trying to, what did you say, lose 10, 15 kilos?
15 kilograms.
Yeah. If that's the goal, the first thing I would ask Chris is what is driving him to lose those 15 kilos? If it's health related as compared to society related, and I just mentioned that because we have an unhealthy view of what health is in society. This I think it all boils down to what's the quote? Nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. And this was a fashion model who was way too skinny. So if it's true, if it's affecting our blood pressure, our liver, or sleep apnea or something where we're having health effects, and it would be helpful to lose weight for physical or health, great. and we've got that motivation in mind, I would say that can be the goal, but the journey is just as important as the goal. And so Chris can be asking himself, well, how's it feel every night when I don't overindulge, right? There can be a little bit of a reward that comes from that every day. And that makes the journey more enjoyable.
How many days or weeks does it typically take to change a habit? If Chris was saying to you, I've been doing this for 3-4 weeks, Doc, I still have the cravings after dinner, struggling a little bit to kick this habit. How long do I need to persist?
Yeah. So one, I would say if I need to persist, it's going to take a long time because it's really about how long do I need until I've learned how my mind works?
How long do I need to be curious?
Yeah. And so for some people that happens pretty quickly. For example, one of the folks I write about in my book, I sent him home to start mapping out his habit loops, actually around anxiety. He comes back 2 weeks later and he's lost 14 pounds when we hadn't even talked about weight loss. So he dialed it in pretty quickly and was losing weight, relatively quickly thereafter.
Without white knuckling it.
Oh yeah, he said it was the easiest weight loss. He went on to lose over 100 pounds and maintain those gains for years, and he still has maintained those gains. So yeah, he said it was the anti-white knuckling approach. And this was so different than the other ones. He said it was the easiest weight loss he's ever had.
And the book kind of puts forward a 21-day challenge.
Yes.
That's presumably just how long it's taking for you to kind of communicate what you want to communicate to people or teach them about their brain?
That's part of it. And part of it is a nod, a wink, wink, nod to all the internet myths out there. And so one of the biggest ones out there around forming a new habit is that it takes 21 days to form a new habit. And that is, the data actually are not supportive of that. This was based on a guy that wrote a book in the 1960s who was a plastic surgeon about how long it took his patients to get used to their new nose jobs. And then somebody wrote a blog on the internet and it blew up. And then now that's like the highest search. If you search for how long does it take, it's based on that.
Kind of like 10,000 steps.
Yeah. Even worse, actually.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Jud. It's been a pleasure to have you back. Thank you for making the time to join us again. I will put a link to your book, The Hunger Habit, Why We Eat When We're Not Hungry and How to Stop, into the show notes. And of course, highly recommend everyone to get out there and grab a copy.
Thank you.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.